You know, if there's one question I get asked more than any other, more even than if quizzes can be quizzical, why can't tests be testicle? That question would have to be, Mark, can choice actually limit your photography? Today, we're going to try and answer that question. So welcome to Leeman, Western Australia, and today what we're talking about is anxiety. And I'm not talking about social anxiety, I'm not talking about that misanthropic phobia of humanity, that disgust and loathing that you feel and insecurity you feel in social situations, although I do suffer from that too. Instead, what we're talking about is the anxiety of choice, where you have too many things to choose from. You know, when you're standing in the supermarket and you've got your iceberg lettuce on one hand and your Kos on the other, and you're thinking, which is going to taste better in my burger, and you can't decide. I'm like that with cameras. I have too many cameras, I have too many choices, and sometimes I think that gets in the way of my photography. So today what I'm doing is I'm limiting myself. I have one camera with me here today, and a fairly primitive camera at that. My Canon P, essentially it's a beautiful silver box that lets light in it. The only thing really it has on it is shutter speeds. Everything else is controlled by the lenses and the film. I have one film, one roll of Kodak Colorplus 200, and I'd love to say I have one lens, but I actually have a few. I've got my 50mm, but what I'm going to try and do, I think, first of all, is try and limit myself just to one lens and see how well I can go just with that. Already I faced my first awkward decision. My plan was to use my 50mm standard lens and capture the beauty of the beach, but I'm beginning to think that that's not actually going to cut it, because there's not much here. It's pretty flat, and I wouldn't say uninspiring. It's quite beautiful, but at the same time I'll just end up with a bunch of snapshots, I think, if I use a 50mm lens today. So I'm going to constrain myself to a 15mm Voigtländer super Wide-Heliar f4.5. My Canon P is like a thread mount, and this is a fairly recent lens produced by Voigtländer. Very modern rendering, quite sharp, but I think what's going to be interesting about this is that it's ultra wide, and that actually can be quite challenging. Firstly, one of the things that you often try and do in photographs is try and remove distraction. Very difficult with an ultra-wide lens. And also the other thing too is that it's very easy to end up with a very empty frame if you try and take landscape shots with it. So I'm going to have to think about foreground, I'm going to have to think about what other distracting elements are in the frame, and I'm going to have to work within those constraints. Let's see how I get on. Okay, so this is interesting. I'm battling both against the light, I think, which means that I've got to try and keep myself, or at least my shadow, out of the image. And I'm also battling with the fact that most of the photos, there's not much in the foreground. Most of the photos are probably going to require me to get on my hands and knees to get some foreground interest. And I don't like doing that. The other thing, of course, is that I can't really compose very easily, so this is almost like pinhole photography. Pinhole photography happening with a 35mm rangefinder camera. Let's see how it goes. I don't know what it is about bollards, witches' hats, safety cones, call them what you will, but they're everywhere. You think that they must breed like rabbits or something. So who says grass doesn't grow in Australia? So I've walked a little bit further down the beach now to the Leeman jetty, and one of the things that I'm finding is that I'm not taking any portfolio shots, let's face it. At the same time, what I am enjoying is working within the affordances and constraints of an old film camera with an ultra-wide lens. The wide lens is allowing me to actually capture far more than I normally would, but with the trade-off of having to fill the frame and fill it with something interesting and well composed. But I think to explain it better, I'm going to have to defer to future me, whose wealth of experience and age will be able to hopefully put it into some kind of context around convergent and divergent thinking. Thanks, past me. Psychologist J.P. Guilford created the terms convergent and divergent thinking in 1956 in his research into creativity. Divergent thinking involves brainstorming for many possible answers to a question, while convergent thinking focuses on reaching that one well-defined answer or solution to a problem. Think about it this way. This is your brain. No, come with me on this. Now, imagine you have to fix something with a nail. Divergent thinking is about considering as many ways of coming up with a solution as possible. You can use a hammer, obviously, but what about a puppy, a pineapple, or even a rocket? Yes, that's a rocket. Of course, convergent thinking is about reducing the options, and the optimal tool for a nail is a hammer. But what if you're working with constraints? You don't have a hammer. That's where it gets interesting. What if you used that dog? See, I bet nobody has thought about this stuff. So what does that mean for photography? You'd think that a high level of affordances promotes divergent thinking. There is a reason why normal people buy modern, full-frame digital cameras and honking wide aperture zooms. But you can basically shoot in the dark at high shutter speeds with high ISOs, and even if you can't, your in-body stabilization will make up for your trembling trigger finger. Sure, there are constraints too. A bigger sensor will give you better low-light performance at the expense of size, weight, and depth of focus. Your phone, on the other hand, is tiny and always with you. But that sensor is tiny too, and despite some computational trickery, you're not going to be able to get those gorgeous bokeh bubbles behind your awkward bathroom selfie. So, convergent thinking is about narrowing things down. In most cases, it's about finding the optimal solution to achieve your goal, but it can also be about working creatively within the affordances and constraints of what you have. In film photography, it's about deliberately putting up roadblocks and having to find ways to overcome them. Cue gear porn slow motion footage of my Canon P. Now, it's not that you can't do a lot with a camera like this, but it's fair to say there's still a lot you can't do with a rangefinder from the 1960s, like focus closer than 1 meter, or fast enough to capture anything that happens in a brief moment, or expose properly without having to guess or carry an external light meter. You get the idea. What it does buy you is the cachet of carrying around a piece of industrial jewelry that makes you look almost as cool as a Leica shooter, meaning you're instantly classified as a lawyer, doctor, or just a geriatric hipster. Or hipster wannabe, since it's obvious you can't actually afford that new M6. And then there's the lens. Talk about constraints.
You have to guess focus with this, but that's not such a problem with a 15mm wide-angle lens. Where you're really limiting your options is when you try to focus on something, particularly in the desolate nothingness that is the Australian seascape. So, a moment of honesty. Looking back at the pictures, I do think 15mm was really too wide for these landscapes. It was great when I shot the pinnacles. It made them look more impressive and more imposing than they actually are. But the Australian summer is already big and empty, and 15mm gives you nothing to look at. Then there's the film. And I'm probably in the minority here, but I think sometimes Australian summers look best in black and white. Don't get me wrong, I haven't seen a sunrise in years, but sunsets can be stunning. It's just that they only last for about half an hour in this part of the world. Other than that, you're dealing mostly with the harsh sunshine, empty skies, and sparse vegetation. And of course, I chose Kodak Colorplus, which is possibly the blandest color film out there, but hey, it's also the cheapest. Given the current state of film prices at the moment, admittedly, that doesn't mean very much. It's kind of like being the least annoying character in an Adam Sandler movie. But I digress. While it's an interesting experience having to tackle the blistering sunshine and featureless beach with what I had, I did pine for the Norwegian fjords at sunset. And I'm just not convinced the constraints promoted the kind of divergent thinking that made for anything particularly innovative. I do have a 20mm Voigtlander lens for my Nikon that might have just about been okay, but 15mm? Oh, look, there's a picture of my hat. Oh, and another picture of me in shadow. Oh, look, my shadow again. So, to sum up, affordances and constraints are good. They promote the kind of convergent and divergent thinking that stimulate creativity and help direct it towards an optimal solution, but constraints are not easy. Honestly, the reason I ended up going to the foreshore was just to find something to stick in the foreground other than my toes or the shadow of my GoPro. But I'll hand back to the youthfully exuberant past me to pick up on that story.
Thanks, future me. So sad to think here I am in my prime, and yet there is a pathetic husk of an old man as he slowly devolves into decrepitude. Sad to see. Now, one of the big issues here is I cannot get close enough to the jack's landing sign without going to the other side, and I think that's not going to work. I think if I can crop it there, that might work. Bit lower down. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief photo walk and discussion about how affordances and constraints are useful in photography, that limiting choices can actually improve our work. Now, if you've liked this video, please show you like it, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because you want to hear when I'm doing my next video, which will most likely be about how super zooms actually give you ultimate choice and completely unleash your creativity. Later.